Good evening. This is Atheist History Week, and I'm John Rafferty, President of the Secular Humanist Society of New York, and also a proud and active member of New York City Atheists, which produces this show. Each week at this time, we look at free thought in history. That is atheism, agnosticism, secularism, humanism, rationalism, skepticism, whatever you want to call it, ism that isn't religion. We look at notable people in history who've had something to do with free thought, the famous, the not so famous, sometimes the infamous, who were born or died or achieved something specific during this, roughly this week in history. We also, of course, look at the religious fun and games like burnings at the stake and pogroms and riots and hangings and beheadings and all the rest of the faith-based initiatives that have made our civilizations, both Western and Eastern, so much fun over the centuries. Let's start this evening with one of probably the nicest people in Western civilization, who was therefore persecuted. As Bertrand Russell said of Benedict Spinoza, who was born on November 24th, 1632, Russell called him the noblest and most lovable of the great philosophers. As a natural consequence, he was considered during his lifetime, and for a century after his death, a man of appalling wickedness. Netherlander Spinoza's wickedness, he applied reason to the world he saw around him. And he never rejected religion. Religion rejected him because he didn't stick to the straight and narrow. He was a rabbi. He was trained as a rabbi. But he read Descartes and Giordano Bruno. He studied Latin with a skeptic. And by the age of 24, he had rejected orthodoxy. Again, let me emphasize, he did not reject religion or God. He just rejected orthodoxy and wanted to apply reason to the study of religion as well as philosophy. Forget it. First of all, the Jewish elders of Amsterdam tried to bribe him to keep his mouth shut, and then the more radical among them even attempted to kill him. There was an assassination attempt. So he changed his name from Baruch to Benedict, left Jerusalem and Amsterdam, and resettled in The Hague in 1667. Not as a rabbi, but as a grinder of lenses. He supported himself at the poverty level, working insanely long hours, which hurt his health terribly. And he never actually got out from under that terrible opprobrium of atheist that was applied to him both by Christians and Jews alike. And of course they made up stuff about him. Since he hadn't married, they dragged out the old one that he must be a homosexual. You know, if you don't like somebody's idea, call them queer. Any rate, Spinoza, whose deism rejected immortality and free will, was basically a pantheist. His Tractatus Theologica Politicus, obviously written in Latin, was what Russell called a curious combination of biblical criticism and political theory, which partially anticipates modern views. Spinoza cautioned that the Bible should be scrutinized like any other literature. He did not believe that the first 5 books, the Pentateuch, were actually written by Moses, or that biblical miracles occurred or that Jesus was divine. Enough to get him in deep trouble with everybody. How blessed our age would be if it could witness a religion freed from all the trammels of superstition, he wrote. He also wrote, the most tyrannical governments are those which make crimes of opinions, for everyone has an inalienable right to his thoughts. Those who wish to seek out the causes of miracles and to understand the things of nature as philosophers and not to stare at them in astonishment like fools are soon considered heretical and impious and proclaimed as the interpreters of nature and the gods. Died of tuberculosis, that overwork that weakened his constitution and allowed him to contract tuberculosis so that he died at the ridiculously young age of 44. Baruch de Spinoza, later Benedict Spinoza, born November 24th, 1632, died in 1677. Born in 1819, on November 22nd, is the novelist George Eliot. At her birth, she was named Mary Ann Evans. She took the name George Eliot because 19th century England, there were too many restrictions on what a woman could do, write, say. She was the youngest child and a favorite of her father's, and she had a governess who was a religious evangelical who made a believer out of Mary Ann, and her first published work was a religious poem. But she studied others, and through a family friend, she read a book called An Inquiry into the Origins of Christianity, and pretty soon she gave up her religion, stopped attending church, and broke her father's heart. He shunned her and sent her off, also broken-hearted, to live with a sister until she promised to re-examine her feelings, which she never did. She remained an atheist throughout the rest of her life. And she began working. She was a shy, respectable woman and a writer who scandalized British society because she sat down and wrote notes to all her friends telling them that she had entered into what she called a free union with George Henry Lewes, the editor of The Leader. Lewes was unable to divorce his wife by virtue of the laws in Great Britain at the time, and so Mary Ann Evans, George Eliot, just moved in with him. Nothing against that in terms of law, but in terms of Victorian society, big no-no. They lived harmoniously together for the next 24 years, in spite of social ostracism and severe financial hardship. She renamed herself, by the way, in private life, Marian, and then took the pen name of George Eliot, by which she is best known, and she started writing fiction. Scenes of Clerical Life came out in 1857. Okay. Then came Adam Bede, a big one, a bestseller. Then The Mill on the Floss, even bigger. Silas Marner, Romola, and Middlemarch. And her reputation as one of the leading novelists of the 19th century in English was definitely cemented. The clergy, she wrote, are practically the most irresponsible of talkers. She lived her life as a free thinker. She was a closet atheist, but definitely a free thinker. Let's move ahead and talk about three Americans, two native-born and one an immigrant, who were lived approximately the same time. Three more disparate people I cannot imagine us talking about, but let's spend the rest of this half hour talking about them. First off, Scott Joplin. The black musician, born November 24th, 1868, obviously the child of slaves. The freeing of the slaves happening only 3 years before his birth. The king of ragtime was born in Missouri, I believe. Born in Texas, no, and then raised in Missouri. His early musical career, if we looked at stereotypes, we might think, oh yeah, sure, the church choir and the church. He was one of the original ragtime musicians, and his early musical career and education took place in the centers of entertainment, brothels and clubs, not in church. In the famous Maple Leaf Club that was shut down because of pressure from local pastors because of its iniquitous practices. This was not a brothel. This was just a place where people danced and sometimes even played cards. He was an early champion of the uniquely American national style of music, ragtime. And he started writing, and including, of course, the famous Maple Leaf Rag, which was named for the club where he worked for so long. He was married at home, not in a church, and his funeral, when he finally died in 1917, was not conducted in a church. Okay, does that make him a free thinker? Well, you have to look at his work. He wrote an opera, Tremonisha, which was very much ignored until recently, until the last 20, 30 years. Tremonisha deals with the fact that the African-American community of Scott Joplin's time was living in ignorance and superstition and misery. And Joplin's opera was all about telling his audience, the black audience, that the way out of ignorance, superstition, and misery was education. He does not propose religion as a solution or even as a help. One of the characters, one of the leading characters in the opera is the pastor. And the pastor's name is Parson All Talk, because all he does is talk and exhort the people to be good. He is totally ineffectual, unable to see his flock's real needs, and being uneducated, unable to provide leadership. Then also in the opera, there's another character. Well, first of all, let's talk about Tremonisha herself, who is a woman who promotes education, is a leader, and she speaks to one of the other characters, the conjurer, Zodcitrik, and she tells him, "You have lived without working for many years." As many, faith healers and conjurers and voodoo men and what preyed on the uneducated African Americans of the South in the early 20th century. You have, by all your tricks of conjuring, she says to the conjurer, you have caused superstitions and many sad tears. You should stop. You are doing great injury. Tremonisha. The opera contains no gospel music, no hymns, no religious melodies, and that's why for a long time it was considered not authentic African-American music. Scott Joplin. He didn't say it out loud, but he put it in his music and his lyrics. In Treemonisha. Born November 24th, 1868. Somewhat earlier than the other two that we're going to talk about. On November 25th in 1837, in Dunfermline, Scotland, Andrew Carnegie was born. And 11 years later, he traveled with his family to Allegheny in Pennsylvania. Within 2 years, at the age of 13, he left school and went to work as a bobbin boy in a cotton mill. In other words, changing the threads on the machines. Then he went to work at Western Union, became a telegraph operator, and then moved from there very obviously, not obviously, but I mean easily to the Pennsylvania Railroad, where he learned all the values of communications and construction and whatnot. And at a very early age went into business for himself. Started the Keystone Bridge Works and the Union Iron Works in Pittsburgh, and became one of the wealthiest men in America, if not the wealthiest. By the late 19th century, Andrew Carnegie was one of the richest men in the world. But he gave it all away. He, in his book, The Gospel of Wealth, published in 1899, as a matter of fact, he proposed that the rich are obligated to give away their fortunes. When he was in his 30s, and he was just rich, not insanely rich, he was already giving away money. First endowing his native town in Scotland, and then eventually establishing 7 different philanthropic and educational corporations. One of them that still bears his name is a college in Pennsylvania that one of my kids graduated from, Carnegie Mellon. His principal desire was to promote free public libraries. When he began his campaign for free public libraries in 1881, they were very scarce in the United States. But his $56 million, remember, in the 19th century, $56 million, built 2,500 libraries. And by the time of his death, he had given away over $350 million. Was he a free thinker? You bet. He wrote, "The whole scheme of Christian salvation is diabolical as revealed by the creeds. An angry God imagined such a creator of the universe, angry at what he knew was coming and was himself responsible for. Then he sets himself about to beget a son, in order that the child should beg him to forgive the sinner. This, however, he cannot or will not do. He must punish somebody. So the son offers himself up, and our Creator punishes the innocent youth, never heard of before, for the guilty, and became reconciled to us. I decline to accept salvation from such a fiend." When he wrote in a private letter, "More and more I believe we should think less and less of heaven, our home, more and more of home, our heaven." What did he mean by home, our heaven? He wrote that it was one of his deep regrets that one wasn't allowed to live here on this earth forever. Because, to me, there's none other satisfactory. And speaking of living or not living, when he was asked to sell 5 acres of his land for a free cemetery open to all Protestants, Carnegie wrote back he wouldn't sell them the land, but he'd give it to them if they'd allow anybody to be buried there who didn't have to be a Protestant or any other kind of Christian. When he wrote that, he said, "Provided it were open to all who desired to rest there, of every sect or of none, We poor mortals, while living our short span, are far too sharply separated. Surely we should not refuse to lie down together at last upon the bosom of Mother Earth. Okay. Andrew Carnegie, born November 25th in 1837. So, an African-American musician, a Scottish-born industrialist, rich man, and philanthropist, and perhaps one of the most iconic Americans of all time, Mark Twain. Who was born November 30th in 1835 and died 75 years later. One of the little anecdotes about Twain that I've always liked is that somewhere in midlife he said that he was born in 1835, coincidental with Halley's Comet arriving. He said, and he fully expected to die 75 years later when Halley's Comet came back. And he did. And he didn't commit suicide. Born, of course, as everybody knows, was born Samuel Clemens in Florida, Missouri. And he grew up in Hannibal, Missouri, for which he's best known, in the slave state of Missouri. And understanding slavery firsthand from the inside out, pretty much to speak, is what became the setting for his two best-known books, Tom Sawyer and The Adventures of Huckleberry Finn. And Huck Finn, by the way, I agree with Ernest Hemingway's assessment a century later that it is the great American novel, in spite of the nonsensical ending of it. He had that, when you read Tom Sawyer and that idyllic childhood in the Midwest, it was Twain's childhood. He said, he wrote later on, when I was a boy, everybody was poor, but didn't know it. And everybody was comfortable and didn't know it. Twain had an idyllic childhood, and a loving mother about whom he later wrote, she was an advocate of the downtrodden and could be beguiled into saying a soft word for the devil himself. Unfortunately, Twain's father died when he was 11, and he left school at the age of 13 to work as a journey printer at the Hannibal Gazette, getting his first taste of journalism. And let's think back to Andrew Carnegie, also leaving school at a very tender age. And we don't suppose that Scott Joplin had very long an education either. He traveled to the East to work as a printer and a writer, and then went back, and as most of you know, he went to work as a pilot on a Mississippi riverboat. And he picked the pen name Mark Twain. Mark is an obvious first name, and Twain, what does it mean? When they were sounding the riverboat, when they'd sound to see how deep the water was, Mark Twain meant 2 fathoms deep. The mark is Twain, 2 fathoms deep, and it's safe to go on. And then Huck Finn, which, of course, has that marvelous scene where Huck, the uneducated young man, thinks about his friend Jim, the runaway slave, and he knows that the law and religion says the runaway slave is a criminal and has to be returned. And Huck thinks it over, and he says, well then, I'll go to hell. But he won't give up. He won't give up his buddy Jim. Mark Twain was not a believer. Mark Twain was an atheist. He probably never said atheist out loud, but let me read a couple of things. One of the proofs of the immortality of the soul is that myriads have believed in it. They've also believed the world was flat. Man has been here 32,000 years. That it took 100 million years to prepare the world for him is proof that that is what it was done for. I suppose it is. I don't know. If the Eiffel Tower were now representing the world's age, the skin of paint on the pinnacle knob at its summit would represent man's share of that age, and anybody would perceive that the skin was what the tower was built for. I reckon they would. I don't know. Most people are bothered by those passages of Scripture they do not understand, but the passages that bother me are those I do understand. The motto, "In God we trust," stated a lie. If this nation has ever trusted in God, that time has gone by. For nearly half a century, almost its entire trust has been in the Republican Party and the dollar, mainly the dollar. Mark Twain, born November 30th, 1835,